The sound that echoed first was not a political slogan, nor the roar of a crowd. It was a scream, sharp, frightened, cutting through the streets of Garoua as a middle-aged schoolteacher collapsed to the ground, struck by a live round during the protests that swept Cameroon after its October election. Moments later, her students' children she taught only hours earlier were seen running for cover as security forces moved in. It was the kind of scene that reminds us that political crises always land hardest on ordinary people, not presidents. And yet hundreds of miles away, another scene was unfolding, quiet, bureaucratic, but powerful enough to shake an entire nation. In Abuja, Nigeria's capital, officials gathered to make a decision that would alter the course of Cameroon's post-election turmoil. They refused Cameroon's demand to extradite Issa Chiro Abakar, the country's main opposition figure, the man who had declared himself the rightful winner of the vote, and the man the government accuses of provoking unrest. Nigeria's refusal wasn't just a diplomatic gesture, it was a statement, one that challenged a 43-year political order in Cameroon and forced Africa and the world to confront an uncomfortable question: when a neighboring nation protects an opposition leader facing possible execution, is it defending democratic principles or interfering in sovereign affairs? What makes this moment even more remarkable is the man Cameroon wants back, a former government minister who fled after security forces surrounded his home, a candidate whose supporters claim he won the election by a convincing margin, and someone who now sits under Nigerian protective custody because returning home could mean a death sentence. As we unpack this unfolding crisis, the protests, the killings, the escape, and the diplomatic shockwave, it's important to ask ourselves what truly defines legitimacy in modern Africa. Is it longevity in office or the will of the people? Is it the ballot box or the security forces? Stay with me through this journey. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories that reveal the real Africa behind the headlines, please consider subscribing and sharing this video with someone who still cares about truth. To understand why Nigeria's refusal to extradite Issa Chiro Abakar is shaking the region, we need to go back to the beginning, to the election that set this entire crisis in motion. Cameroon went to the polls on October 12, 2025. It was an election many citizens entered with heavy skepticism, not excitement. The country was preparing to vote once again under President Paul Biya, a man who had governed since 1982. At 92 years old, Biya was seeking an 8th consecutive term in office, an extraordinary span of power that covered nearly half a century. For many older Americans watching from afar, imagine one president serving through the Reagan era, the Clinton years, the Obama presidency, and still sitting in office today. That is the scale of Biya's rule. Opposing him was Issa Chiro Abakar, a former government minister who resigned only months earlier in June to challenge Biya. His rise was unexpected, in part because the man many believed would lead the opposition, Maurice Kamto, was barred from running by the Electoral Commission in July. Kamto had finished second in the 2018 election and was one of Biya's most persistent critics. Removing him from the race opened the path for Issa Chiro to emerge as the central opposition figure. But even before a single vote was counted, worries began to surface. Observers from the Catholic Church, the most widely trusted neutral institution in Cameroon, documented multiple irregularities on election day. They reported finding the names of deceased voters still listed on the rolls. They noted that ballots were distributed unequally across regions. And in some places they witnessed intimidation around polling stations. Yet the day remained largely free of mass violence, leaving a sense of uneasy calm. That calm shattered on October 14th. Before the government released any official figures, Issa Chiro held a press conference in which he declared himself the winner. His campaign displayed tally sheets collected from polling stations across the country, showing him leading decisively in many regions and claiming a nationwide total of at least 54.8%. His announcement electrified his supporters but enraged the government. Officials quickly warned that only the Constitutional Council had the legal authority to announce results, accusing him of violating electoral law. Just days later, on October 20th, the National Vote Counting Commission issued provisional results: Biya at 53%, Chiro at 35%. On October 27th, the Constitutional Council confirmed Biya as the official victor with 53.6%. But the opposition did not accept these numbers. Civil society groups, independent observers, and the International Crisis Group reported that tally sheets posted publicly at numerous polling stations appeared to show Issa Chiro winning by what they called a convincing margin. Suddenly, Cameroon had two competing realities: the government's official count and the opposition's documentation from the ground. As the dust settled, anger rose. Supporters of Issa Chiro insisted that the official results did not match what they had witnessed at their own polling stations. In the age of smartphones, photos of tally sheets traveled quickly. Questions spread faster than the government could suppress them. And soon thousands of Cameroonian students, workers, mothers, clergy began gathering in the streets, demanding transparency and accountability. The Biya government responded not with dialogue, but with force. On October 21st, protests erupted in Garua, where a schoolteacher was shot and killed, the first confirmed fatality of the post-election unrest. By October 26th and 27th, demonstrations spread to Douala Marua and even the capital Yaoundé. Security forces deployed in large numbers using tear gas first and then live ammunition. Witnesses reported chaos streets filled with choking smoke, young men scrambling for cover, terrified families huddling inside shuttered homes. The death toll quickly became a point of fierce dispute. United Nations sources reported 48 civilians killed. Opposition groups claimed 55. The Cameroonian government acknowledged only 16 deaths, numbers widely considered a severe undercount. Human Rights Watch documented at least 312 people arrested between October 26th and November 10th. Many were charged with hostility against the homeland, insurrection and rebellion offenses that can carry the death penalty under Cameroonian law. Some were detained simply for sending WhatsApp messages encouraging relatives to vote for the opposition. Students were arrested for social media posts. Entire neighborhoods in Douala experienced lockdowns and house-to-house searches. By late October, the country was no longer debating an election. It was confronting a crisis of legitimacy, one that would soon cross its borders. As the streets of Cameroon filled with anger and fear, the spotlight began to turn toward one man, the opposition candidate Issa Chiro Abakar. To the government, he was the agitator behind the unrest. To his supporters, he was the man whose victory had been stolen. And to millions of African observers, he quickly became a symbol of a continent's ongoing struggle between aging power and rising democratic demand. By October 27th, the situation had escalated beyond protests. Cameroon's intelligence services reported that snipers had taken positions around Issa Chiro's residence in Garua. 2 of his supporters were shot and killed outside the gate of his compound. The message was unmistakable. The state was tightening its grip inch by inch. That same evening, Cameroon's powerful Interior Minister, Paul Atanganji, went on state television. His declaration was blunt. Issa Chiro, he said, would be prosecuted for inciting violence and organizing illegal demonstrations. The government framed him not as a candidate challenging an election, but as a dangerous instigator threatening national stability. This framing served a purpose. It laid the legal foundation for his arrest and possibly his execution, since several of the charges carried the death penalty. On October 28th, security forces surrounded Issa Chiro's home. Residents nearby reported seeing truckloads of armed personnel sealing off the streets. Witnesses described the tension in the air as brittle, like something that could snap at any second. The order was clear: Issa Chiro was to be arrested before dawn. But when security forces stormed the residence at first light on October 29th, they found nothing. The house was empty. Issa Chiro had vanished. His escape instantly became the most discussed topic in the region. How had a man surrounded by security forces slipped away who had moved him? How had he reached the border? For a nation accustomed to Biya's tight control, the mere fact that Issa Chiro had disappeared was astonishing. Then came the twist that shook Cameroon's political core. On October 31st, Issa Chiro posted a message on his campaign's Facebook page, one that spread like wildfire across the country. In it, he thanked the loyalist army that had, according to him, escorted him to safety and was ensuring his protection. If the claim was true, it meant something unthinkable. Elements of Cameroon's military had disobeyed the government and sided with the opposition candidate. Although the claim could not be independently verified, it raised questions that terrified the Biya government. Did parts of the military believe Issa Chiro had actually won? Were there fractures inside the armed forces? Was a larger upheaval brewing? However he managed it, multiple intelligence reports confirmed that Issa Chiro crossed the border into Nigeria near Yola in Adamawa State sometime between late October 28th and early October 29th. Some sources said he crossed on foot. Others said he traveled in civilian vehicles. The exact method didn't matter. The fact remained, he was on Nigerian soil, and Cameroon wanted him back. Within days, Cameroonian officials contacted their Nigerian counterparts, describing Issa Chiro as a fugitive fleeing criminal prosecution. They submitted formal requests and began applying diplomatic pressure. According to several intelligence documents and Nigerian media reports, Cameroon even sent a special operations team into Nigeria prepared to take custody of Issa Chiro immediately after arrest. By November the 2nd, the crisis reached its breaking point. Acting on intelligence from Cameroon, Nigerian security forces located Issa Chiro in Yola and detained him. But this moment, intended by Cameroon as the final step toward bringing him home in chains, became instead the turning point that reshaped the entire conflict. As Nigerian officers questioned the man in custody, they realized they weren't holding a criminal fugitive. They were holding Cameroon's main opposition candidate, a man claiming victory in a contested election, someone accused of political crimes that could lead to execution. What happened next unfolded behind closed doors. Senior officials in Abuja, likely from the Ministry of Interior and possibly the Office of the President, were consulted. Within hours, a decision came back that Cameroon did not expect Nigeria would not extradite Issa Chiro Abakar. He was placed under Nigerian protective custody. The Cameroonian team waiting to transport him was informed the operation would not proceed. And just like that, the crisis stopped being a domestic Cameroonian matter and became a regional diplomatic earthquake. The reaction was immediate. In Cameroon, government officials expressed outrage, accusing Nigeria of sheltering a criminal and interfering in their sovereign affairs. On the streets, opposition supporters celebrated seeing Nigeria's decision as validation of their struggle. And across social media, Panafrican activists praised Abuja for standing on the side of democratic principles rather than political convenience. What began as an attempted arrest inside Cameroon had now become an international standoff, one that neither side seemed willing to back down from. Nigeria's refusal to hand over Issa Chiro Abakar did not merely stop a rendition operation. It triggered a series of civil, social, and political consequences that spread across borders, reshaping the lives of ordinary citizens and testing long-standing alliances between two nations that depend on each other more than they admit. Inside Cameroon, the government's shock quickly hardened into anger. State-controlled media launched a coordinated campaign labeling Issa Chiro a terrorist, a foreign-backed destabilizer, and most ironically, a threat to regional peace. Officials accused Nigeria of harboring a fugitive and undermining Cameroon's internal security. For a government that had maintained its grip through strict control of institutions for more than 4 decades, Nigeria's decision felt like a direct challenge to its authority. But among civilians, especially in opposition strongholds, such as Garua, Douala, and Marua, the reaction was very different. When news spread that Issa Chiro was alive, out of reach, and protected by Nigeria's security forces, many people described feeling for the first time since the election a flicker of hope. It did not stop the grief of those who had lost loved ones, nor the fear of those whose family members were still detained. But it created a sense that the government could no longer act with total impunity. In fact, almost immediately after the news broke, calls for a nationwide lockdown protest emerged from Issa Chiro's coalition, running from November 3rd to 7th. These protests were not grand marches in the streets. They were acts of quiet resistance. Markets remained closed, transport reduced, neighborhoods fell silent. In many cities, especially in the north, the compliance rate was so high that observers likened it to a country holding its breath. The message was clear: the opposition may have lost the streets temporarily, but it had not lost the people. At the same time, the humanitarian situation worsened. According to Human Rights Watch, at least 312 people were detained between late October and mid-November, many held without seeing a judge. Some families had no idea where their relatives were being kept. Others described paying bribes to police officers just to confirm a loved one was still alive. For older Americans watching this unfold, it evokes familiar images from Cold War crackdowns where the price of political disagreement was disappearance or death. And yet, beyond the suffering, an unexpected shift began to take shape. Cameroon's political system, long considered one of the most rigid in Central Africa, suddenly appeared vulnerable. The possibility, real or imagined, that elements within the military had protected Issa Chiro during his escape raised fears inside the ruling elite. Loyalty, once assumed, now had to be questioned. Could the security apparatus still guarantee Biya's control? Would foreign partners continue to treat Cameroon as stable? If parts of its own army had quietly defied orders, Nigeria also felt the consequences. while many Nigerians in the northern regions supported the protection of Issa Chiro, viewing him as a fellow Muslim and a man fleeing persecution, the government in Abuja had to consider the diplomatic cost. Cameroon remains a crucial partner in the multinational Joint Task Force, the regional military coalition fighting Boko Haram and the Islamic State West Africa province around Lake Chad. If relations deteriorated too far, intelligence sharing and security coordination could weaken, potentially emboldening extremist groups. But Abuja's decision also strengthened Nigeria's image in unexpected ways. Panafrican activists celebrated it as a new African standard, where governments no longer automatically side with incumbents accused of repression. Legal experts praised Nigeria for respecting international refugee law and avoiding the mistake it made in 2018 when it illegally extradited 47 Anglophone separatists. And for many African citizens watching from afar, Nigeria's stance offered a rare example of a state choosing legal principle over political convenience. Thus, by mid-November, the consequences of Nigeria's refusal radiated outward inside Cameroon: more protests, deeper mistrust, rising fears, and a fragile sense of hope among citizens. Inside Nigeria, a complex mix of moral satisfaction, security concerns, and diplomatic tension. Across Africa, a new question emerging. If Nigeria can refuse a powerful neighbor in the name of law and democracy, who might be next? The crisis was no longer just about one man. It was about what kind of political future Central Africa and perhaps the whole continent was beginning to move toward. From an American perspective, what happened between Nigeria and Cameroon is more than a regional dispute. It is a window into a continent quietly redefining the meaning of legitimacy, sovereignty, and democracy. And for Americans, especially those who remember the Cold War, the age of strongmen, and the long cycles of coups and counter-coups, this crisis feels both familiar and strangely new. Washington has not taken a formal position on the incident, but U.S. policymakers are watching closely. Cameroon has long been considered a stability partner in Central Africa despite its authoritarian tendencies. Paul Biya, at 92, is one of the last relics of the post-colonial generation leaders who rose to power during the era of Reagan, Thatcher, and Gorbachev and never stepped aside. For decades, Western governments tolerated such rulers, arguing that stability mattered more than political competition. But this time, that equation is shifting. Human rights organizations, American think tanks, and regional analysts have noted that Cameroon's post-election crackdown mirrors the same patterns seen in Ivory Coast, Tanzania, and Uganda over the last decade: mass arrests, internet blackouts, lethal force against demonstrators, and an official narrative insisting order must be preserved at all costs. For Americans who lived through the civil rights era or watched U.S. foreign policy evolve across Africa, these are troubling signs. They raise uncomfortable questions. Why does a 43-year presidency remain acceptable? Why are peaceful protesters being killed? And why does the international community respond with statements of concern rather than consequences? Nigeria's refusal to extradite Issa Chiro Abakar, rooted in international law, refugee protections, and the fear of facilitating a political execution, stands in stark contrast to the cautious, almost neutral responses of global powers. It highlights a new phenomenon that older generations of Americans may find striking: African countries increasingly holding each other accountable in ways Western institutions no longer do. This shift is happening alongside deeper continental trends. Many Americans may not fully realize Senegal's youth-led democratic transformation in 2024. The coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, where populations supported the removal of entrenched elites. Kenya's Gen Z uprising against economic inequality and state repression. These movements, though different in method, reflect a generational rejection of gerontocracy, corruption, and political impunity. And they raise questions not only for Africa, but for global policymakers in Washington, Brussels, and Paris. The U.S. finds itself in a delicate position. On one hand, it values Nigeria as a strategic partner in West Africa, economically, militarily, and diplomatically. Nigeria's decision to follow the law strengthens its democratic credentials, aligning with values Washington publicly endorses. On the other hand, openly supporting Nigeria against Cameroon risks destabilizing a region that already struggles with Islamist insurgencies, refugee displacement, and economic fragility. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is responding with predictable caution. The African Union congratulated Biya on his victory, but expressed deep concern about violence. France, Cameroon's former colonial power, called for restraint without questioning the election's legitimacy. The European Union echoed similar balanced language. The United Nations urged investigations but avoided addressing the disputed vote. To many Africans and to many Americans who have watched decades of inconsistent foreign policy, these reactions feel hollow. And so a new geopolitical question emerges. If African countries like Nigeria begin defending democratic principles where global powers hesitate, what new order might emerge in the next decade? For Americans, especially older viewers who have witnessed the world change multiple times, this moment in Central Africa offers a chance to reflect. Is Africa entering a new era of political self-correction? Does Nigeria's stand signal a continental awakening? And how will this shape future relationships between the U.S., Nigeria, Cameroon, and emerging leaders like Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso, who himself challenges old power structures? What happens next will determine more than one man's fate. It will help define Africa's political trajectory and America's place within it. In the end, this crisis is not simply about Issa Chiro Abakar, nor about a single disputed election in Central Africa. It is about something far more fragile and far more universal. It is about the fate of ordinary citizens caught between an aging political order and a new generation demanding their place in the world. It is about what happens when people raise their voices for transparency and are met with bullets instead of answers. And it is about whether the institutions meant to protect them, regional bodies, global powers, even neighboring governments will stand with them when it matters most. Across Cameroon today, families continue searching for sons, daughters, and spouses detained during the post-election crackdown. More than 312 people remain in custody, many without seeing a judge. Mothers stand outside police stations with folded documents pressed to their chests, begging for updates. Fathers sit silently on wooden stools in shuttered markets, wondering if their children will ever come home. These are not just political statistics. They are human lives, altered forever. And yet amid this darkness, a different kind of story is being written on the continent, a story where legal principles sometimes triumph over political fear, where regional actors like Nigeria make decisions that ripple far beyond their borders, and where citizens from Senegal to Kenya to Burkina Faso are refusing to accept the idea that power belongs only to those who have held it the longest. But this moment is also a warning. If Nigeria's stand becomes an isolated exception quickly, overshadowed by diplomatic pressure or geopolitical fatigue, then the message to Africa's youth will be devastating. That truth does not matter, that elections are symbolic, and that the world will look away when the powerful suppress the powerless. Yet if this moment becomes a precedent, if countries across the continent start holding each other to higher standards, then something extraordinary may be unfolding quietly before our eyes. This is where your voice matters, especially for my American viewers, over 60 who have witnessed history turn many times before. You understand what it means when nations reach a tipping point. You know how movements rise, falter, and rise again, and you know that silence in moments like this is never neutral. So let me ask you directly, should Nigeria formalize Issa Chiro Abakar's asylum, even if it risks angering Cameroon? Or should the argument of sovereignty prevail, even if it sends a political opponent back to face charges that may lead to execution? And beyond this crisis, consider the broader question. Do you believe leaders like President Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso, who challenge old power structures, are genuinely ushering in a new era for Africa? Or are they simply temporary symbols in a continent still searching for stability? Your thoughts, your questions, and your skepticism matter. Please share them in the comments. Let your perspective be part of this continental conversation. And if you believe that truth matters more than the headlines and that stories from Africa deserve to be told with depth, dignity, and honesty, then please subscribe, like, and share this video. Because what happens in Cameroon, in Nigeria, in Burkina Faso, and across Africa will shape the world our children and grandchildren inherit.